It was barely dawn, and the city still wore its blanket of sleep, the streetlights making streaks on the slick, rain-soaked pavement. Heavy clouds hung low, pouring down on cracked sidewalks, transforming every puddle into a mirror for the gray sky above. Bus number 12 screeched to a stop at the curb, a blast of warmth and fluorescent light cutting through the morning gloom. Ray Foster stood beneath a battered black umbrella, water streaming down his coat and dripping from the brim of his old army cap. 82 years old, but still walking straight. Ray's hand gripped a worn leather cane with a soldier's steadiness. With a practiced motion, he tucked his umbrella, careful not to drip on the other passengers, and boarded the bus. The harsh scent of wet clothing and burnt coffee filled the air inside. He stepped up to the driver, a young man with earbuds in, scrolling through his phone in between stops. Ray reached for his wallet, pulling out a plastic-sleeved military ID. Edges softened, lettering faded, but still readable if you took the time. He offered it with quiet dignity. "Veteran fare," he said, voice gravelly but steady. The driver glanced at the ID, then looked Ray up and down with a smirk. "That thing's expired." "Rules are rules," the driver said, loud enough for everyone near the front to hear. Ray kept his tone even, unfazed by the casual dismissal. "I've used this every Thursday for 7 years," he replied, trying to keep his voice neutral, hoping to avoid a scene. A few eyes flickered his way, but the driver just shrugged, more impatient this time. "Look, I don't make the rules, old man. Either pay up or step off. I've got a schedule to keep." Ray hesitated, feeling the weight of a dozen silent stares prickling at the back of his neck. For a moment, he considered reaching for change, but his pride, always too stubborn, refused to let him scramble for coins while people watched. From the back, a teenage voice, muffled by headphones, called out, "Old dude just wants a free ride. Happens all the time." Laughter trickled up from a cluster of kids, filling the bus with its mean, youthful echo. Ray stood straighter, meeting the driver's eyes, searching for some spark of understanding or respect. He found only boredom. "I served this country," Ray said softly, but the words fell flat in the fog of rain and neon, drowned out by the engine's idle rumble. The driver, growing irritated, waved his hand toward the door. "Come on, you're holding us up." No one spoke up. No one argued. Ray felt every year of his age in that moment, shoulders heavy beneath his coat. Quietly, he turned around, adjusted his cap, and stepped off the bus, his cane tapping out a lonely rhythm against the wet concrete. Rain pelted his back as the doors hissed shut and the bus rolled away, taillights glowing red through the curtain of water. Ray stood at the edge of the curb, umbrella forgotten, letting the rain soak him completely. His breath hung in the air, visible for a second before disappearing. He looked down at the military ID in his hand. His name, faded photo, branch, serial number. A lifetime distilled into a piece of plastic that no one seemed to care about anymore. Cars sped by, splashing water up onto the sidewalk. Ray's vision blurred, but whether it was rain or something else, he couldn't say. For a second, he was back in Korea. Mud, gunfire, men calling for help in voices that still haunted his dreams. He blinked hard, steadying himself. He took a shaky breath, squared his shoulders again, and limped toward the next intersection, refusing to let anyone see him falter. Behind him, the city kept moving, lights changed, horns blared, and the world barely noticed an old man left standing in the rain. But inside the bus, the atmosphere had shifted. Whispers began, glances exchanged, and one elderly woman at the back furrowed her brow, as if she recognized the name she'd glimpsed on the faded ID. But Ray Foster kept walking, every step a silent protest, every drop of rain a reminder that dignity sometimes costs more than a fare. He didn't look back. The doors of Bus 12 slammed shut, and the hum of the engine faded into the hiss of rainfall outside. For a moment, inside the bus, there was only a thick silence, heavy, awkward, the kind that settles in after witnessing something wrong and knowing you did nothing. Some passengers stared out at the blur of the city. Others kept their eyes down, pretending not to care. But the energy had shifted, the earlier laughter gone, replaced by a restless guilt. At the back, Mrs. Bernice Turner, a woman in her late 70s with steel-gray curls tucked beneath a worn blue scarf, leaned forward in her seat, squinting at the fogged-up window. She had recognized that face. Hard to forget a man who'd once carried her brother half a mile through enemy fire in Korea, refusing to leave anyone behind. Her voice, surprisingly strong, cut through the hush. "Wait! That's Doc Foster, from the 1st Medical Battalion. He saved my brother in Korea." The kids stopped snickering. Heads turned. The teenage boy who had mumbled earlier yanked off his headphones, glancing nervously at the woman. The bus driver, Eric, looked into the rearview mirror, the color draining from his face. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. At the front, a middle-aged man in a construction vest pulled out his phone, hands still shaking from what he'd just seen. He typed quickly, "Raymond Foster Medal of Honor." The search results loaded in seconds. Old news clippings, yellowed photographs, a black and white image of a young soldier standing at attention, medals glittering on his chest. He read aloud, almost in disbelief. "Raymond Foster, Army Medic, Medal of Honor, saved 12 men in a single night. Korea 1952. A murmur swept through the passengers. Someone gasped. Another man sitting closest to the door muttered, "That can't be right. That was the old guy who just got kicked off?" The first drops of shame crept across the bus. He just got put out in the rain. People began to fidget, shifting in their seats, uncomfortable. The silence was heavy, and even Eric, the driver, seemed frozen. He stared at his own reflection in the glass, seeing not just himself but the faces of those he'd dismissed. Faces that maybe, for the first time, he was actually seeing. Without another word, the man with the phone stuffed it into his pocket, grabbed his umbrella, and dashed down the aisle. Someone's got to go after him. The doors hissed open. He sprinted down the steps, holding his umbrella high against the downpour. On the street, Ray was already halfway across, cane tapping, coat drenched. The man called out, "Sir, sir, wait!" But Ray barely heard him over the roar of traffic and the pounding rain. At that moment, a cyclist zipped down the far lane, saw the old man stepping into the crosswalk, and, without hesitation, skidded his bike sideways, arms flailing to block a taxi that was barreling toward the intersection. "Hey, watch it!" the cyclist shouted, holding up a gloved hand, body angled to protect Ray. The taxi screeched to a halt, tires hissing. Ray, startled, stopped in his tracks, realizing someone had stepped in for him, something he'd spent a lifetime doing for others. Back on the bus, a young woman with a child on her lap pressed her forehead to the window, voice trembling as she whispered to her son, "That's a real hero, baby. People should know what he did." Someone else filmed the scene, thumbs shaking as they tried to steady their phone. Inside the driver's seat, Eric's heart pounded. The words of Mrs. Turner echoed in his ears, "Doc Foster, Medal of Honor." His mind flashed to his own grandfather, stories told over Thanksgiving dinner about men who'd served, who'd come home quiet, never talking much about what they'd seen. Had he just put a man like that out into a storm, over 75 cents? He bit his lip, unsure what to do, shame growing in the pit of his stomach. Outside, the man with the umbrella finally caught up to Ray. "Mr. Foster, please let me walk you. That was out of line back there. The whole bus. We're sorry." Ray, surprised, paused beneath a flickering street lamp. Water streamed down his face, but he met the man's gaze squarely. "No need to apologize for folks you don't control, son. Sometimes the world just moves too fast for old men like me." The biker rolled up, soaked to the skin, shaking off his gloves. "Traffic's crazy. You all right, sir?" Ray managed a faint smile, exhausted but grateful. "I've seen worse days," he replied, voice low but strong. A small crowd had started to gather. Passengers from the bus, the cyclist, the man with the umbrella, even a woman who had stepped out of the coffee shop on the corner, curious about the commotion. For the first time in a long while, Ray Foster was the center of attention. Not because he'd asked for it, but because the truth of who he was had finally caught up with him. Meanwhile, back on the bus, Mrs. Turner reached into her purse, pulled out an old, faded letter, and clutched it to her chest. A letter her brother had written from Korea, mentioning the medic named Foster who'd risked everything to bring him home. She wiped away a tear and looked out into the storm, her heart aching with gratitude and guilt all at once. As the bus idled, unsure whether to move on or wait, the passengers began to talk among themselves about service, sacrifice, and how easy it is to overlook the quiet heroes among us. Someone suggested, "We should do something. Write a letter to the city. Post what happened online." Another replied, "He deserves better than this." By the time the light changed and the bus finally pulled away, the energy inside had transformed. What began as an ordinary rainy morning had become a lesson in humility, a reckoning with how we treat those whose stories we barely know. Ray Foster continued down the sidewalk, umbrella now held above him by a stranger, a biker standing watch at the curb, and the eyes of a city, suddenly, unexpectedly, wide open. Underscore, 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 end of part 2. Noban da san sang, toi se tiep tuk voa part 3. Hey zak nan hoak yu kao chin sua, them tin tiet theo iban. After the chaos, the rain softened, drumming on Charleston's empty morning streets. The brief commotion faded, and so did the crowd. People drifting back to routine, conversations already blending into the city's background noise. Ray Foster, though, was left standing with the man who had chased after him. With a nod and a quiet thank you, Ray insisted, "I'm fine, son. I walk this route every Thursday." The man hesitated, wanting to do more, but Ray's pride, layered and silent as the overcast sky, wasn't easily penetrated. Eventually, the stranger handed Ray his umbrella and returned to the bus, leaving the old soldier alone in the gentle patter. Ray's cane tapped with each step, echoing off brick walls and empty storefronts. The umbrella was borrowed and a little too short, so water still beaded along the edge of his army cap, dripping onto his weathered face. His shoes squelched, his pants were wet up to the knees, but his pace never faltered. The city was waking up, a bakery opening shutters, a florist sweeping puddles from her doorstep, delivery trucks rumbling by, headlights gleaming on the slick asphalt. Ray's destination wasn't far. He crossed into a small park, one that people passed by every day but rarely noticed. He sat on a wooden bench, paint peeling, facing a row of rain-soaked oaks. There he reached into his jacket and pulled out a plastic-wrapped photograph. Carefully, with trembling hands, he peeled the plastic away and gazed at the picture inside. It was of a woman, her hair pulled back, eyes smiling at the camera. The the kind of smile that lingers long after a photograph is taken. Her name was Margaret. Ray placed his thumb over the photo, tracing the lines of her face. "Morning, Maggie," he murmured, voice barely above the rainfall. His eyes drifted across the park toward a small cemetery just beyond the fence. There, a stone with the name Margaret Foster gleamed softly, newly washed by the rain. Ray leaned his cane against the bench, his old bones aching as he stood. Every step across the sodden grass was measured and deliberate. He approached the grave, knelt with a soldier's steadiness, and laid a single fresh carnation at the base of the stone. "Sorry I was late, love. Bus was a bit rough today," he whispered, the humor in his voice gentle and self-deprecating. He brushed a bit of debris off the headstone, wiping the marble clean with his coat sleeve. For a long moment he stood there, silent, letting the rain speak for both of them. Ray stayed until his knees hurt and his legs trembled from the cold. When he finally straightened, his gaze lingered on Margaret's name. He saluted, briefly, quietly, then made his way back to the bench, where he sat and let the world pass him by for a while. As he watched the rain and remembered, his mind drifted back, farther than Margaret, farther than Charleston, back to Korea in 1952. The smells came first: mud, diesel, gunpowder, and the copper tang of blood. His hands clenched on his cane as old ghosts resurfaced. He remembered running, always running, bullets hissing through the air, explosions shaking the earth. He saw his own hands, trembling and bloodied, pressing bandages against wounds that wouldn't close. He heard the cries, "Medic! Doc! Over here!" He remembered carrying a young soldier on his back, legs useless from shrapnel, the enemy closing in. He remembered refusing evacuation, arguing with officers who ordered him to rest. "I won't leave my men," he'd said, stubborn as ever, voice raw with determination. He remembered the freezing cold, the stink of trench foot, and the nights spent sitting awake, listening to men talk about home, about wives and sweethearts and baseball games. He remembered losing friends, good men, better than he'd ever been. He remembered medals pinned to his chest, presidents shaking his hand, camera flashes blinding his eyes. None of it ever felt real. What felt real was the warmth of Margaret's arms when he came home, the way her laughter filled the tiny kitchen, the look she gave him when the nightmares wouldn't let him sleep. Ray blinked away the memories, pulled the photo closer, and breathed in the cool, wet air. "I miss you, Maggie," he said, "but I think you'd have laughed at this morning. Rules are rules, huh?" He managed a wry grin, remembering how Margaret never let him get too serious, how she'd tease him for getting worked up about little injustices. "You'd have given that driver an earful, love. Probably would have marched right up and told him what's what." Nearby, a group of kids in rain jackets cut through the park, chasing a soccer ball. They didn't notice the old man on the bench or the medals hidden in his pocket. To them, he was just another quiet figure on a gray morning. Ray sat for a while longer, letting the rain ease the ache in his bones. When he finally rose, he took a last look at Margaret's stone. "See you next Thursday," he promised, tucking the photo carefully back into his jacket. He made his slow way home, moving past shuttered shops and puddle-lined streets. His apartment was small but neat, filled with memories. A folded American flag in a glass case, photographs yellowed with age, military medals tucked in a drawer that almost never opened. The walls were lined with books and old maps. Ray moved quietly, hanging his coat to dry, setting his cane by the door. He poured himself a cup of instant coffee and stood by the window, watching the rain beat against the glass. He let the silence fill the space around him, The silence he'd earned, maybe, or the silence left behind after a lifetime of service. Later, as he read the paper and listened to an old jazz record spinning on the turntable, Ray felt the gentle calm of routine settling over him. He didn't expect anything from the world anymore, didn't want recognition or special treatment. But as he sat there, he could not shake the feeling that something was changing out there in the city. Some ripple in the air, a sense that the world had noticed his quiet dignity, if only for a moment. What Ray didn't know was that the video of his encounter on the bus was already spreading. But for now, the old soldier just sipped his coffee, gazed at the folded flag, and remembered the woman who'd kept him fighting long after the war was over. The rain had let up by the time Ray Foster made his way back to his small apartment, but the city remained washed clean, fresh and subdued under the pale morning light. As he stepped inside, the familiar warmth greeted him, a quiet stillness only interrupted by the ticking of an old wall clock and the occasional creak of wooden floorboards. Ray hung his wet coat by the door, propped his cane in the usual corner, and stood for a long moment, letting the silence settle. He moved through his routine, carefully peeling off his damp socks, setting the kettle to boil, opening the living room blinds just enough to let the weak sunlight filter through. On a narrow shelf near the window stood the folded American flag, polished smooth and framed beneath glass. Nearby, a photo of Margaret in her garden, sunlight in her hair, looked back at him with gentle patience. Ray's hands, knotted with age and old injuries, moved slowly as he prepared his tea. There was comfort in small rituals, and as he stirred in the sugar, he allowed his mind to wander, back to the cemetery, to Margaret's gravestone, to the memories that pressed at him every Thursday. His morning bus rides to her resting place had become a kind of pilgrimage, a quiet promise that he would not let her memory fade into the noise of daily life. Across town, in the busy offices of the city's transit department, the consequences of the morning's incident began to unfold. A supervisor, Mr. Daniels, a lean, meticulous man in his 50s, sat behind his desk, listening as his phone buzzed insistently. He pressed the speaker button, barely glancing at the screen. "Daniels here." "Sir, this is Gina on Route 12, came the nervous voice of the dispatcher. "We've had some complaints. There was an issue with a passenger, a veteran, apparently. The driver refused his fare." Daniels frowned, immediately opening the bus system's digital logs. He pulled up the records for Route 12, scanning for any incident reports. One driver's name blinked red: Eric Larkin. Daniels clicked into the system, reading the brief, hastily typed note. Passenger attempted to use expired veteran ID for fare, refused. Passenger exited. Incident occurred 7:11 a.m. But alongside the terse report, there was a burst of messages, witness complaints, social media screenshots, even a short video clip showing the old man's back as he was turned away in the rain. Daniels leaned forward, replaying the video, feeling a twist of unease in his chest. He paused the frame on the man's face, zooming in on the faded ID card. He typed the name into the city's records: Raymond Foster. A few seconds later, the screen filled with search results: military commendations, news articles, photographs from decades past. One headline stood out: Charleston's hometown hero, Doc Foster, honored by 3 presidents. Daniels scrolled further, a copy of a citation from the Korean War, signed by President Truman himself, detailing Foster's courage under fire as a medic with the 1st Medical Battalion. Daniels rubbed his temples. He remembered his own father, a Navy man, who had once spoken about Doc Foster with a kind of awe usually reserved for legends. The idea that someone like Foster could be so quietly, publicly humiliated for a 75-cent fare made Daniel's blood run cold. He picked up the phone and dialed Eric, the young bus driver, but got no answer. He left a message. "Eric, we need to talk about this morning. Call me back immediately." Elsewhere, Ray Foster sat in his living room, turning the day's newspaper over in his lap. The headlines were all the usual fare. Politics, sports, a lost dog reunited with its family. Nothing about the rain or the bus or him. He felt a strange sense of relief. He'd never sought the spotlight. What mattered now were the quiet things. Margaret's memory, the letters he still wrote her every week, and left tucked behind her gravestone, the sound of jazz on the radio. His peace was interrupted by a soft knocking at the door. Ray opened it to find a young woman standing in the hallway, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. She was nervous, glancing at her feet as she spoke. "Mr. Foster, I saw what happened this morning. I'm sorry, my granddad was in the army too. He always talked about you. I just wanted to bring you these." Ray accepted the flowers with a quiet smile, nodding his thanks. "It's a small world," he said softly. "Tell your granddad I remember him. He always had a way of making us laugh when things got tough." The girl smiled, her eyes shining, and Ray watched her go, feeling a bittersweet warmth. He set the flowers beside Margaret's photograph, whispering, "Still making friends, Maggie. Even now." Back at the transit office, Daniels continued his investigation. He printed out Ray's file: birth date, military service, medals earned, volunteer work at the local hospital, notes from mayors and presidents, faded black and white photographs from parades long past. Daniels read each one, feeling the weight of history pressing down. How easy it was to let memories fade. How quickly a hero could be forgotten, his dignity reduced to a line in an incident report. Ray, meanwhile, made his way to the cemetery again, the clouds breaking and sunlight spilling down as he walked. He knelt at Margaret's grave, arranging the wildflowers and his weekly letter. "I'm sorry I was late, love. Bus was a bit rough today," he said, repeating his gentle joke, letting the words linger. He sat for a while, tracing the letters of her name on the headstone, letting his memories wash over him. The day they met, the first time she'd kissed him, the look on her face when he returned from war alive, against all odds. In the stillness, Ray's mind wandered, wondering if anyone would remember him when he was gone, or if the stories would fade away like names in the rain. He thought of the soldiers he'd carried, the ones he couldn't save, the nights spent holding Margaret's hand and promising he'd never forget. But even heroes grow old, and as Ray rose to leave, he felt both the weight of his years and the invisible legacy he'd left behind, carved not in stone, but in the lives he'd touched, the kindness he'd shown, the love he still carried. What Ray couldn't know was that his story was already spreading, first quietly, then like wildfire, through the city, then far beyond. People who'd once been saved by Doc Foster, or whose lives had been touched by his quiet courage, began to remember, to speak his name, to remind the world that some legacies never truly fade, no matter how quietly they are lived. And so, as the sun broke through the clouds and Ray walked home beneath its golden light, the world around him began to wake up to a forgotten hero, one who had never asked for honor, but who deserved it all the same. Even as Ray Foster made his quiet way home that afternoon, the city was changing around him in ways he could not imagine. The gentle hum of the internet, invisible but ever present, carried his story far beyond the drizzle-soaked streets of Charleston. It started with a shaky phone video, just 45 seconds long, posted by a teenager who, moments before, had been laughing in the back of Bus 12. The video captured the moment Ray stood at the front, his cane trembling just a little, the faded military ID held out in one hand, the rain streaming down the glass behind him. The caption beneath the video read, "This vet got denied a 75-cent ride because his ID looked old." For a few minutes, it lingered among a handful of local followers, just another oddity in a stream of morning updates. But within an hour, something shifted. The video caught the attention of a local veterans group, a Facebook page with thousands of members, many of them old soldiers who recognized the tone of Ray's voice, the cut of his shoulders, the stubborn dignity that doesn't fade with age. They shared it, adding their own comments, some angry, some heartbreakingly sad. "We know that name, Doc Foster, saved my uncle in Korea. My father wouldn't be alive today if not for that man. Shameful." The comments rolled in, rapid and relentless. A woman from Savannah posted, "My granddad served with Ray Foster. He used to say, 'If you ever meet Doc, shake his hand for me.'" A retired sergeant wrote, "My unit's annual reunion always starts with a toast to Doc Foster. I hope that driver apologizes in person." Someone else simply said, "America forgets too fast." By lunchtime, the video had been shared to Reddit, then picked up by a local Charleston news station. A headline appeared on their website, "Decorated veteran denied city bus ride. Community outrage grows." Within hours, the national media began to notice. News anchors read the story on the noon broadcast. Talk radio hosts debated city policy, asking why any veteran, especially one as decorated as Ray Foster, would be turned away for a fare most people wouldn't even notice missing from their pocket. In a downtown cafe, a young woman scrolled through her phone, eyes widening as she watched the video. Her father, a lieutenant colonel, called her from Fort Bragg. "You see this, Em? That's Doc Foster. He patched me up when my Humvee went down. Don't let them forget who he is." Across town, the teenage boy who'd filmed the video sat on his bed, phone blowing up with messages from friends and strangers alike. He watched the video again, a knot tightening in his stomach. What had seemed funny, even harmless, that morning now looked different, mean, thoughtless. He opened the comments, reading words like disgrace, disrespect, and failure. For the first time, he wondered what it meant to be a bystander. Meanwhile, in Ray's apartment, the phone rang off the hook. Reporters, advocacy groups, even a city councilwoman wanting to visit. Ray sat in his worn armchair, glancing at the blinking red light on his answering machine, and let the calls go. He didn't care for interviews or attention. He just wanted a quiet afternoon with his memories and his books. But outside, the story was no longer his to keep. On Twitter, trending under #HonorDocFoster, celebrities and politicians weighed in. A famous talk show host tweeted, "America needs more men like Ray Foster and fewer rules that shame them." A congressman posted, "Veterans deserve our respect, not humiliation. Charleston, do the right thing." An Army general, retired but still formidable, recorded a video staring straight into the camera. "I served with Doc Foster in Korea. The city of Charleston owes him more than an apology. They owe him dignity." That evening, a local news van rolled up outside Ray's apartment building. Neighbors peeked out their doors, watching as a young reporter rehearsed her script in the rain. "We're here outside the home of Raymond Foster, whose story has captured the nation's attention. We're told he's a quiet man, rarely seen without his army cap, and beloved by those who know him." The camera panned to Ray's window, curtains drawn tight, a sliver of lamplight flickering behind the glass. The bus company's press office, meanwhile, scrambled to respond. Their inbox was flooded with angry emails, veterans demanding action, city residents threatening to boycott. The PR director, sweating beneath the fluorescent lights, drafted a statement. The incident involving Mr. Foster is currently under review. We take our veterans' dignity seriously and are working to ensure this does not happen again. But it was not enough. Veterans organizations across the country mobilized, holding meetings, sending letters to City Hall, organizing peaceful protests outside the bus depot. Posters appeared on lampposts and in shop windows. Respect our veterans. Stand with Doc Foster. At the hospital where Ray had volunteered for years, nurses gathered around the break room TV, watching the coverage with teary eyes. An orderly named Marcus shook his head. I see that man every week. He sits with the dying, listens to their stories, never says much about himself. Why does it take a scandal for people to notice? That night, Ray found himself unable to sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Margaret's gentle laughter and the way she used to tease him about his stubborn pride. You always tried to stay invisible, Ray, she'd say, but the world won't let you disappear. He smiled into the darkness, grateful for her memory. He remembered carrying men through mud and bullets, patching wounds, singing lullabies to boys barely old enough to shave. He remembered medals pinned to his chest, cold, heavy, never as comforting as a simple thank you. He never expected recognition, but as the city buzzed with his name, as voices rose on his behalf, Ray Foster realized something. Maybe his story, once lost to time and memory, could now remind others of sacrifice, of humility, of the debt owed to those who served quietly. Before dawn, Ray made his way to the kitchen, pen in hand. He wrote a letter to the editor of the local paper. I don't want apologies or fame, just kindness for the next old soldier who gets on your bus, and a little patience for those who walk slower than you do. By morning, his letter would be published, and his story would have traveled further than he ever could. But for now, he stood at his window, watching the rain taper off, grateful for the silence, for the memories, and for the unexpected ripple of dignity spreading out from a single rainy morning. By the time the sun rose over Charleston the next morning, Ray Foster's story was no longer just a headline. It was a reckoning. From city council chambers to neighborhood diners, from online forums to local churches, a restless energy had taken hold. Charleston had always prided itself on respect for tradition and honor for its veterans, but now, beneath the polite surface, outrage simmered. The mayor's office was the first to react. Phones rang off the hook, the inboxes flooded with messages. How could this happen? One email demanded. If this is how we treat heroes, what hope is there for the rest of us? Even the mayor, a former Marine, called an emergency meeting. In her office, she stood before her staff, holding a printout of the viral video. Ray's rain-soaked figure, the weary set of his shoulders, the impassive look on the driver's face. We need to get ahead of this, she said, her voice low, angry. Not just for the cameras. This is about our city's soul. A press conference was called that same afternoon, hastily organized on the steps of City Hall. Reporters clustered beneath a gray sky as the mayor stepped up to the microphones, the city seal gleaming behind her. We have seen the video, she announced, looking directly into the cameras. We have read your letters and your posts. The treatment of Mr. Foster does not reflect the values of Charleston or the gratitude we owe our veterans. We are investigating this incident fully, and we are committed to making things right. The statement made the evening news in every major city. National outlets picked it up, splicing in footage of Ray from years before, shaking hands with presidents, riding in parades, smiling softly beneath the shadow of his service cap. But outside the glare of the cameras, the city was boiling. Local talk radio was ablaze with angry calls. "My father fought in Vietnam. I can't believe this happened here." People forget, but Doc Foster never did. He was there for all of us. The bus company, under siege, scrambled to control the narrative. The CEO issued a carefully worded statement. The Charleston Transit Authority is reviewing its fare policies and employee training procedures. We are grateful for the service of our veterans and regret any distress caused to Mr. Foster and his family. But the words rang hollow for many. Veterans organizations marched outside the company's downtown offices, flags raised high. Their signs were simple but fierce. "Respect our heroes." Dignity has no expiration date. Never again. Local news ran interviews with men and women in uniform, some old, some young, who told their own stories of being dismissed, overlooked, or quietly ignored. A Vietnam veteran named Leonard spoke with trembling hands. "It's not about free rides. It's about being seen, being remembered. Doc Foster helped my brother in '68. If we can't honor him, we're lost." The backlash rippled out into unexpected places. High school history teachers scrapped their lesson plans to talk about Ray Foster, the Korean War, and what it means to serve and sacrifice. At one elementary school, a third grader raised her hand and asked, "Why didn't anyone stand up for him?" Her teacher paused, searching for an answer, before writing 3 words on the board: courage, memory, kindness. Meanwhile, Eric Larkin, the young bus driver at the center of the storm, found himself at a crossroads he never expected. He had been called in for questioning by the bus company's HR department, his palms sweating as he waited outside the office. Inside, company executives reviewed the security footage, the passenger complaints, the angry emails pouring in from across the country. When Eric finally entered the room, he faced a row of stern faces, supervisors, union reps, a city official there to observe. He was asked to watch the video again, this time in silence. As he saw Ray step off into the rain, umbrella forgotten, the reality of his actions hit him with full force. He remembered his own grandfather's stories, the medals gathering dust in an old cigar box, the pride in his family's eyes when they spoke of service. For the first time, Eric felt the sharp pang of regret, not just for what he'd done, but for how easily he'd dismissed the man before him. A union representative tried to soften the blow. "It was just a misunderstanding," he insisted to the press later. Eric followed protocol. This shouldn't ruin his life. But the city wasn't satisfied. Veterans, their families, and everyday citizens gathered in parks and community centers to talk, to remember, to demand change. Stories poured out, of old men in faded jackets, women in wheelchairs, young soldiers home from overseas, each with tales of quiet service met with indifference or impatience. A group of local business owners pooled money to offer free coffee and meals to veterans for the next month. Florists donated flowers to the cemetery where Margaret Foster rested, her grave now blanketed with tributes from strangers who had never met her but felt the weight of her husband's story. At the hospital where Ray volunteered, the director set up a display. Photographs of Ray in uniform, letters from soldiers he'd helped, messages from grateful families. On the wall, a quote from Ray: "Respect doesn't need a uniform, just eyes that see." But even in the midst of all this, Ray himself kept to his routine. He still visited Margaret's grave, still took the long walk through the park, still listened to jazz on his battered radio. The phone rang less now, as the news cycle moved on, but the letters poured in. Handwritten notes from school children, old friends, even strangers in other states. They spoke of gratitude, of shame, of hope. Ray read each one, placing them in a wooden box he kept by his chair. And everywhere, quiet conversations unfolded. On buses, in kitchens, at church suppers. Charleston was awake, finally asking itself what kind of city it wanted to be. Ray's story had become a mirror, forcing the city to see itself, flaws and all. And in homes all across the country, people looked at their own fathers, grandfathers, neighbors, their quiet heroes, and wondered, if he was on that bus, would I have stood up? The city's outrage continued to surge, but in the middle of it all, Eric Larkin felt more alone than ever. He had spent the past 3 nights barely sleeping, tossing in his small apartment as headlines flashed across his phone. Charleston demands justice for veteran. Doc Foster's story ignites national debate. Bus driver placed under review. His friends sent him nervous texts, some supportive, others distant. His parents, who lived upstate, called every night. His father asking sharp questions, his mother trying to reassure him, though he could hear the worry in her voice. Eric had started driving for the city bus system right after high school. It was a steady job, good benefits, the kind of work that didn't ask too many questions. He'd always thought of himself as a decent guy. He followed the rules, kept his head down, tried not to get involved in drama. Now, all of that felt small and hollow. The morning of the review meeting, Eric walked into the transit office with hands clenched and head bowed. HR called him in. A small, sterile conference room, a long glass table, supervisors sitting on one side, a city official on the other, and a union rep beside him. They played the video. Eric watched himself on screen, face hard, voice impatient as he told Ray Foster to step off the bus. He winced, feeling shame flood through him. He heard his own words, "Rules are rules," and saw how little compassion he had shown. A knot formed in his chest. He tried to explain, "I didn't realize who he was. The policy says," but even as he spoke, the city official cut him off gently. "It's not about policy, Eric. It's about people. Didn't you see his eyes?" Afterward, they left Eric in the room with nothing but his own thoughts and the echo of his mistake. The union rep patted his shoulder on the way out, but Eric felt numb. For hours he sat there, staring out the window at the slow-moving traffic, thinking about the headlines, the angry letters, the veterans marching downtown. He thought about his own grandfather, who'd fought in the Pacific. He remembered sitting on the porch as a child, listening to the old man talk about ships and jungles, bravery and fear. His grandfather had always worn his VFW cap to church on Sundays, always held doors for others, always thanked people who wore uniforms. Eric remembered asking him once, "Did you ever get scared?" His grandfather had smiled, eyes far away. "Everyone gets scared, son. Courage is what you do after." Eric stared at his reflection in the window, trying to see himself as the world now saw him. He wondered if he'd ever really paid attention to the people who boarded his bus every morning. Single mothers, janitors on the night shift, old men with faded medals. How many times had he chosen efficiency over empathy, procedure over presence? How many times had he ignored the small voice inside, urging him to slow down, to look someone in the eye, to ask, "Are you all right?" After the meeting, Eric was sent home on unpaid leave until the investigation wrapped up. The next day, restless and heavy-hearted, he decided to visit his parents. He drove north for 3 hours through pine woods and small towns, trying to find comfort in the familiar roads. At his parents' house, his father met him at the door. "You messed up, son," the old man said, not unkindly. "But that's not the end. Go see Grandpa. He's been asking about you." Eric found his grandfather sitting in his favorite chair, a patchwork quilt over his knees, sunlight streaming through the window. They sat in silence for a while, the old man sipping tea, Eric twisting his hands. Finally, Eric spoke. "Grandpa, I did something bad. I was rude to a veteran, kicked him off my bus in the rain. The whole city's mad at me. I didn't know. I didn't even ask his name." His grandfather studied him, blue eyes sharp but gentle. "Did you apologize?" Eric shook his head, shame burning in his cheeks. "Then that's the place to start." "We all screw up, Eric. What matters is what you do after." They talked for a long time, about the war, about kindness, about the quiet debt owed to those who served. His grandfather told him stories Eric had never heard, of being overlooked when he came home, of the nights he lay awake wishing someone understood the scars he carried. "I'd have given anything for someone to look me in the eye and say, 'I see you.' Not just for the uniform, but for the person." On the way home, Eric made up his mind. He called the transit office, asked if he could meet Ray Foster in person. The answer was tentative, but eventually they agreed to arrange it. Before the meeting, Eric spent a sleepless night writing a letter, scratching out draft after draft until his words finally matched his feelings. "Dear Mr. Foster, I'm sorry for what I did. I didn't see you, really see you. I forgot what it means to serve others, even when you're not wearing a uniform. I hope you can forgive me. If you're willing, I'd like to apologize in person." The day of the meeting, Eric dressed in his best clothes, even borrowing his father's old army tie. His hands shook as he walked up the steps to Ray Foster's building. Inside, Ray sat at his kitchen table, the sunlight slanting across his medals and photographs. He looked tired, but not angry. Eric handed him the letter, voice trembling. "Sir, I'm sorry, not just for the rules, for not taking the time to look closer." Ray read the letter in silence, then looked up. "Respect doesn't need a uniform," he said quietly. "It just needs eyes that see." Eric blinked away tears, grateful for the chance to make amends. "I want to do better," he promised. Ray nodded. "That's all anyone can ask." As Eric left, he felt the weight of guilt lift. Just a little. He still had a long way to go, but he'd taken the first step. Later, Ray sat in his chair by the window, holding Eric's letter in his lap. He thought of all the times he'd been overlooked, all the moments when a simple act of kindness could have changed everything. He smiled, thinking of Margaret, and hoped that maybe the city, maybe the whole country, would learn to look a little closer, listen a little better. And so, as the sun set over Charleston, two men, one young, one old, carried forward a quiet lesson: that dignity isn't a policy and compassion is a choice, renewed every day. It was a Thursday morning, 1 week after Ray Foster's humiliating walk in the rain, when the city of Charleston chose to show what it had learned. The sky was clear and the air crisp, the early light glinting off windows as the city buzzed with a sense of anticipation. Across the city, buses were running a little late, not because of breakdowns or traffic, but because drivers were slowing down at stops, greeting passengers with a little more care, casting longer glances at faces they might otherwise have overlooked. In the operations yard behind the main terminal, Eric Larkin stood in front of his locker, his nerves frayed. His uniform was pressed, his shoes shined, but his hands trembled as he pinned a service ribbon, borrowed from his grandfather, over his chest pocket. Today was more than just a shift. It was a chance at redemption. All week, the city had been planning a gesture. The mayor, veterans groups, bus company officials, and Ray's neighbors had all come together, determined to right what had gone wrong. A small plaque had been ordered, hurried through production. It would be bolted above the front seat of every Route 12 bus, inscribed with 6 simple words, reserved in honor of Raymond Foster. Outside, the crowd was already gathering at Ray's regular bus stop. Neighbors, reporters, veterans in uniform, schoolchildren waving small flags, TV cameras pointed toward the curb. A city official waited with a bouquet of flowers. At the edge of it all stood Ray, his old army cap in hand, his cane freshly polished, dressed in his best suit and tie. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, glancing shyly at the crowd, but Margaret's photograph, tucked inside his jacket, gave him courage. Eric pulled the bus up to the curb and parked with more care than usual. He took a deep breath, stepped out, and walked through the waiting crowd to stand in front of Ray. For a moment, the noise faded, and it was just the two of them, an old soldier and a young driver, each carrying the weight of what had come before. Eric stood at attention, his voice steady. "Mr. Foster, on behalf of the city, and for everyone who didn't look close enough, I want to say I'm sorry. This seat belongs to you." He gestured to the freshly cleaned, freshly dedicated front seat, a blue velvet rope draped across it, the plaque gleaming in the morning sun. Ray hesitated, moved almost to tears by the sight. He placed his hand on Eric's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Young man," he said softly, "respect doesn't need a uniform, just eyes that see. But thank you for seeing me today." The mayor stepped forward, offering Ray the bouquet and shaking his hand with genuine warmth. "Mr. Foster, we're grateful for your service, to your country, to your city, and to the quiet dignity you've shown all your life." A round of applause swept through the crowd, rising, falling, and then rising again as other veterans stepped forward, one by one, each laying a hand on Ray's shoulder, sharing quiet words of thanks and memory. Some recounted stories of their own fathers and grandfathers, the wars they had survived, and the kindnesses that had sustained them. As cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Ray took his seat at the front of the bus. Eric took the wheel, glancing in the mirror to make sure Ray was comfortable. For the first time in his career, Eric felt pride. Not for following the rules, but for doing what was right. The bus rolled away from the curb, heading down its usual route, but nothing about this morning was routine. Passengers boarded in silence, pausing at the plaque, some saluting, some nodding, some pressing handwritten notes into Ray's hands. A mother lifted her daughter so she could read the inscription. A high school football player offered Ray his varsity jacket for warmth. As the bus made its way through downtown Charleston, people on the sidewalks waved and cheered. At each stop, Ray greeted new faces, some familiar, some strangers, all wanting to share a word or a handshake. The bus filled up, but nobody sat in Ray's seat. He noticed an elderly woman standing near the back and called her forward, patting the seat beside him. She smiled, wiping away tears. "You saved my brother in Korea. He always said you were the bravest man he ever knew." Ray squeezed her hand, humble and quiet. He was braver than he thought. At the next stop, a young soldier in dress blues climbed aboard, saluting Ray before taking a seat nearby. "Sir, I joined up because of men like you." Ray nodded, emotion thick in his voice. "Then I know we're in good hands." As the bus continued, the mood was festive but respectful. Stories were shared, photos taken, and promises made to remember, not just today, but every day. At City Hall, officials watched the ride on a live feed, moved to see the community come together. The mayor, wiping her eyes, turned to her staff. "Let's make sure this isn't just a one-time thing. Let's keep honoring our veterans every day, in every way we can." When the bus finally reached the end of its route, Ray stood up slowly, steadying himself on his cane. Eric met him at the door, holding it open wide. Ray looked back at the passengers, young and old, black and white, rich and poor. All of them changed, even if just a little, by the morning's journey. He spoke quietly, but everyone heard. It isn't medals or ceremonies that make us worthy. It's what we do for each other in small moments, when no one is watching. Thank you, Charleston, for seeing me. Let's keep seeing each other. He stepped down onto the sidewalk, greeted by more applause. Eric joined him, standing tall beside the older man. In that moment, neither the crowd nor the cameras mattered. What mattered was that an entire city had chosen, for a day, to honor the quiet dignity that so often goes unnoticed. That night, as Ray sat at his kitchen table, he laid the bouquet next to Margaret's photograph and smiled. You were right, Maggie. Sometimes the world does catch up. He looked out the window at the stars above Charleston, heart full, knowing the journey wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt invisible, and everyone brave enough to finally look a little closer. News of Ray Foster's redemption ride spread faster than even the viral video that started it all. The local paper's front page carried a photo of Ray and Eric standing side by the new plaque on Route 12. The headline read, "A city remembers its heroes." National news picked up the story, but something different happened this time. It wasn't just a fleeting headline. Instead, Ray's story became a symbol, a call to action, reaching well beyond Charleston. All over the city, the mood was changing. At the bus depot, workers hung up posters printed by the city's marketing office. Heroes don't always wear boots, but they walked in them once. Each bus now bore a copy near the entrance, and even routes outside Ray's neighborhood adopted the tradition, designating a front seat for veterans. Veterans groups from around the country sent letters and small tokens to Ray's home. One day, a package arrived with a handwritten note from a Marine in California. Doc Foster, you saved my father's life in Korea. We still talk about you at every Thanksgiving. Inside was a photograph, a black and white shot of Ray, young and determined, carrying a wounded man to safety. Ray had forgotten about the photo, but holding it in his hands brought tears to his eyes. Local news followed up with segments about veterans in the community, sharing their stories of quiet service, of sacrifices that rarely made the news. A retired nurse called the station to talk about Ray sitting with her husband in his final days, telling stories to ease the fear. He didn't brag or talk about medals, she said on air. He just listened and made people feel seen. Word spread to local schools. At West Charleston Elementary, Miss Hendricks's 5th grade class watched a video about Ray and then started their own project, Everyday Honor. Each student was encouraged to interview a veteran in their family or neighborhood and write a short essay about what they learned. The classroom walls quickly filled with stories and photographs. Tales of heroism, yes, but also stories about kindness, struggle, and dignity. One student, a shy girl named Harper, wrote about her grandfather. He fixes my bike when it's broken. He taught me to tie my shoes. I never knew he fought in Vietnam until I asked. I learned he's brave, not just because of the war, but because he always helps others, even when he's tired. The project went viral. Schools across the city, then the state, picked up the idea. Some made short documentaries, others created art installations in their hallways. Teachers noticed a shift. Children looked at their elders with more curiosity, asking questions and, more importantly, listening to the answers. Social media, too, took up the cause. The hashtag #EverydayHonor trended for days, with people posting stories and photos of the veterans in their own lives. Some were somber, a Gold Star mother posting a photo of her son lost in Iraq. Some were playful, a woman sharing a snapshot of her dad saluting the family dog in a makeshift uniform. All were united by a single message: never assume you know the full story of the quietest person in the room. The city's bus company saw its ridership increase as more people took public transit just to ride the famous Route 12. Tourists came by to see the plaque and, if they were lucky, meet Ray Foster himself. Ray, always a little bashful, took to carrying a notebook so he could write down the names and stories of everyone he met. He wanted to remember them too. But the most important impact was subtler. A shift in the way people saw one another. On the buses, riders started offering seats more freely. Drivers paused to help elderly passengers, sometimes lingering at stops to chat with regulars. Stories of small kindnesses began to appear in the local news. A young man helping a veteran with his groceries. A group of high school students organizing a fundraiser for the VA hospital. In the evenings, Ray would return home, tired but happy. His table filled up with letters and thank you cards, many from people he had never met. One letter, from a teacher in Pennsylvania, stood out. Dear Mr. Foster, your story helped my students understand that real heroes are all around us. We just need to look. Thank you for reminding us never to judge by age, by uniform, or by first impression. Ray placed it beside Margaret's photograph, whispering, You always said it was the small things, Maggie. The mayor's office capitalized on the energy. They launched a citywide campaign, See the Person, Not Just the Past. Billboards went up, community forums were organized, and every city employee, bus drivers, clerks, police, received new training in dignity and empathy. Veterans across Charleston, some who had spent years in the shadows, began to step forward and share their stories. A World War II vet finally spoke at his granddaughter's school. A nurse who'd served in Vietnam gave a talk at the library. For many, it was the first time they had ever been asked about their service. The story even reached Capitol Hill, where a senator from South Carolina gave a speech on the floor about the dignity of everyday Americans who have given everything and expect nothing. He finished with Ray's words, Respect doesn't need a uniform, just eyes that see. Meanwhile, Ray continued to live his simple life. He still took the bus to Margaret's grave every Thursday. Sometimes a stranger would join him, eager to hear his stories or simply to say thank you. Ray always insisted the conversation go both ways. He wanted to hear their stories too. One cold evening, Ray sat at his kitchen table, the city quiet outside, and reflected on all that had changed. He knew that the attention would fade. The cameras would go elsewhere. But the lesson, he hoped, would linger. Never assume you know someone's worth. Never assume a gentle voice means a gentle life. Never assume there isn't a story behind every tired smile or slow step. And as he drifted off to sleep, Ray felt the comfort of knowing that, at least for a little while, his city, and maybe the whole country, had remembered what it meant to look, to listen, and to honor the people walking quietly among them. Thursday arrived again, quiet and golden with the early light of a Charleston spring. The world kept moving. News cycles spun. New faces appeared at bus stops, and the city's energy hummed along its old rhythms. But some things, the most important things, had changed for good. Ray Foster woke as he always did. Before dawn, his small apartment glowing with the soft warmth of habit. He poured coffee, fed the neighborhood stray cat that now seemed to have adopted him, and ran a thumb over Margaret's photograph, whispering, "Morning, love." The kitchen table, still covered in cards and letters from strangers, felt less like a monument and more like a living bridge, a reminder that kindness ripples outward in ways no one can predict. He dressed slowly, putting on his best shirt, polishing his shoes just as Margaret would have liked. The old army cap found its familiar place on his head. Before stepping out, he took one last look around, a lifetime condensed into a handful of photographs, medals tucked away in drawers, and more precious than all, the daily routines that defined his quiet dignity. Outside, the city was already awake. Flower vendors set up their carts, children in crisp uniforms hurried to school, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from a corner bakery. Ray's walk to the bus stop was slower than it used to be, but no less purposeful. As he reached the corner, he nodded to the mailman, who saluted him in return. Bus 12 rounded the bend right on time. Eric Larkin was at the wheel, his posture a little straighter these days, his smile easier. The plaque above the front seat shone in the morning light, reserved in honor of Raymond Foster. Eric opened the door with a theatrical bow. "Morning, Mr. Foster. Got your usual seat ready?" Ray grinned and climbed aboard, greeted by a chorus of hellos, neighbors, veterans, parents with kids. Some faces he knew well, others were new, but every eye met his with respect, not pity. He eased himself into the front seat, feeling the familiar vibrations of the city beneath his feet. For a moment, he simply watched, listening to the sounds of life unfolding. A mother scolding her son for forgetting his homework. A young man rehearsing for a job interview under his breath. An old friend sharing the day's crossword puzzle clues. Midway through the route, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, stepped forward with a shy smile and offered Ray a seat she didn't realize he already had. He chuckled, touched by her earnestness. "Thank you, sweetheart. You keep that kindness with you. That's worth more than a medal." The bus rolled on, sunlight slanting through the windows. Ray watched the city go by. Parks and playgrounds, murals painted on brick walls, people helping one another in small, unnoticed ways. He felt the peace that comes from knowing he had lived a life of service, not for applause, but for the quiet, lasting rewards. Friendship, gratitude, and the gentle pride of a job done well. Later that morning, Ray made his regular stop at the cemetery. He walked the winding path to Margaret's grave, set down a bunch of fresh wildflowers, and sat for a while, talking softly about his week. "The city's been busy, Maggie. They're learning, slowly, but they're learning. Maybe all it takes is one person standing up or sitting down to remind the world what matters." He took out the notebook he now carried everywhere and read a few of the stories people had sent him, some about old wars, others about small acts of courage on city buses, in classrooms, on playgrounds. He smiled, letting the spring breeze carry the memories into the sky. As he stood to leave, a young father passed by with his son, pausing respectfully. "That's Mr. Foster, son, the man I told you about." The boy looked up, uncertain. Ray offered a gentle nod. "You look out for your dad, okay?" The father and son smiled, moving on, but Ray saw the boy's wide eyes, a look that mixed awe with the simple, honest hope of youth. Returning home, Ray stopped at a coffee shop. The barista, new in town, recognized him, poured his coffee on the house, and said, "My brother's in the Marines, sir. He says thank you." Ray laughed, shaking his head. "Tell him the real thanks comes from you. Keeping your eyes open, being there for someone when it matters." That afternoon, as the city moved through its routines, Ray's story became less about one man and more about the lessons left behind. Posters about everyday honor still hung in bus shelters and schools, but they had become a quiet part of the landscape. Reminders that dignity is not a gift to be given or taken, but a birthright carried within. At a local high school, a student council meeting ended with the president, a senior whose father served in Afghanistan, reminding everyone, sometimes the greatest act of courage is to look closer, listen longer, and treat every stranger like they matter. In living rooms, on porches, at kitchen tables, the story of Doc Foster became a parable, retold not just for its drama, but for its humanity. The question echoed again and again. If you saw him, would you have looked closely enough? In his apartment that evening, Ray turned on the radio. Jazz, low and soft, filling the space with memory and hope. He made a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the city lights twinkle to life one by one. He thought about Margaret, about the men and women he'd served with, about the new friends he'd made, and the old wounds that had finally found a kind of healing. He knew his story would fade from the headlines. He knew the world would move on. But as he finished his tea and prepared for bed, Ray Foster felt no bitterness, only gratitude. He had lived to see his city remember, if only for a moment, that dignity doesn't expire, that every life has a story worth knowing, that sometimes the smallest acts, a seat, a thank you, a moment's patience, can honor a lifetime of quiet service more than any parade. He turned out the lights, looked once more at Margaret's photograph, and smiled. Rest easy, love. We did all right. And somewhere in Charleston, a child gave up her seat for an old man she'd never met. A driver greeted his passengers by name. And the lesson lived on, gentle, persistent, and true. He didn't ask to be honored, but dignity should never expire. Some men ride with memories deeper than medals, and the smallest act of kindness, a seat, a thank you, can honor them more than a parade. If you saw him, would you have looked closely enough?